If it's Thursday, disaster in Hawaii, where raging wildfires have killed at least 36 people and mass evacuations are underway to try and get thousands off the devastated island of Maui. Plus, breaking news, the U.S. and Iran strike a rare deal to release 5 Americans imprisoned in Iran. It's part of an exchange that includes the release of Iranian prisoners and $6 billion in frozen Iranian government assets. Plus, new developments in the trail and in the Trump trials as prosecutors propose starting the former president's D.C. federal trial just 2 days before the Iowa caucuses. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Chuck Todd, reporting from Washington, and we are watching more breaking news out of Hawaii. It's a devastating scene. Multiple wildfires are burning on the island of Maui. The historic town of Lahaina is in ruins. At least 36 people are dead. Officials fear the number will rise. The fires, which ended up spreading quickly on Wednesday, were fueled by an 80-mile-per-hour wind and a lot of gusts, and it's now among the deadliest wildfires in U.S. history. Second only now to California's Camp Fire, which killed 85 people in 2018. Thousands of locals and tourists, which included the mayor of San Francisco, London Breed, had to be evacuated from the northern part of the island as the fires quickly spread. Many are now in shelters as firefighters work to contain 3 fires that remain active. Airlines, including Hawaiian Air and Southwest, are now operating evacuation flights off the island. You can see how narrowly people escaped the fire as it quickly took over the main part of town in this shocking video here. Over 270 structures have already been destroyed by the flames, including the house in this footage.
There's their car.
More than a dozen people were rescued by the Coast Guard after they simply jumped into the Pacific Ocean in a desperate attempt to escape the flames. This afternoon, President Biden approved an official disaster designation for the fires, meaning that local efforts can now be supplemented by FEMA legally and federal aid. We'll be speaking with the FEMA administrator in a moment. The National Guard also activated over 130 guardsmen today to aid in the response. Here's what President Biden said
We're working as
earlier.
quickly as possible to fight these fires and evacuate residents and tourists. In the meantime, our prayers with the people of Hawaii, but not just our prayers. Every asset we have will be available to them, and they've seen their homes, their business destroyed, and some have lost loved ones, and it's not over yet.
Our NBC News correspondent Dana Griffin has the latest on the ground in Maui.
Chuck, we are at one of the largest evacuation centers here in Maui, where some 300 to 400 people spent the night here. Several people have also slept in the distance in the parking lot inside their cars. We're seeing a lot more people show up today to get food, water, and clothing. I can tell you one of the more remarkable things about all of this, I've literally talked to people who have walked out of here who say their homes are gone, but they still have a smile on their face and they are talking about gratitude, grateful that they are alive, grateful that they still have loved ones. As you know, at least 36 people have been confirmed dead, and that number is likely to grow as crews get out and assess the damage. It's still unclear how much surface level has burned and if there's a containment level. We are waiting to get those updates. We know the road to Lahaina, the historic town that really thrives off the local economy, the tourist economy, has been decimated. It'll take years and at least $1 billion to rebuild that town. We're not sure when they will reopen the road so that people can go into those neighborhoods to assess the damage. I can tell you many people are returning and will not have a home to go back to.
Yeah. Dana, thanks very much. I'm joined now by NBC News meteorologist Michelle Grossman. She's here to help break down sort of the origins of this fire and how it spread so fast here. I mean, I hate to use this analogy of, quote unquote, a perfect storm, but it seemed like there were a lot of events that had to happen for this to become as devastating as it is. Walk us all through it here.
Yeah, Chuck, I feel the same way. I know I use that term, too, because it was three ingredients that came together for this disaster to happen. So first we have an ongoing drought, so really dry vegetation. That kind of acts as kindling, right? And then we had relatively low humidity, which was so low, and we had really gusty winds. It wasn't just from the hurricane, because we keep focusing on Dora, but this is what happened. We had a Category 4 storm, now a Category 2 storm, 200 miles south of the Hawaiian island chain, interacting with a big area of high pressure. So really strong systems interacting together to kind of create this wind tunnel here, and really strong winds. You mentioned it before, up to 80 miles per hour. The good news is we're seeing better conditions, but that all came together to create this, and we saw those flames really fast and really furious, because we have some really dry land there. We are seeing that drought continuing. So the winds will continue to subside. I just looked. We saw winds gusting around 22 miles per hour, much better than the 38 today, much better than the 70, 80 we saw yesterday, and they will continue to decrease as we go throughout the day. So we've dropped all wind advisories, all wind warnings, all high wind warnings, and the red flag warnings have also been dropped. That is good news. Now, as we go throughout the night, we're looking at very dry winds continuing on the leeward side. We're looking at a little bit of light rain falling, but that is on the other side where we don't need the rain. We need the rain over these fires. We still have 3 active fires burning. So by midnight tonight, we're looking at winds about 10 miles per hour. And Chuck, as we go throughout the next 5 days, I look through next Wednesday, we're looking at really sunny conditions. It's going to be really dry, low humidity still, and also really low winds. At least the winds are going to keep it on the low side, but we're looking at the drought continuing as we go throughout the next couple of weeks at least.
And describe their drought. I read it was, look, we know that extreme weather seems to be the norm wherever we live now.
Yeah.
But this was moderate drought conditions. This wasn't extreme drought conditions, right? I mean, is there something the locals should have been more prepared for? Or is this really a bizarre anomaly?
Yeah, and I love how you said that. We're not in extreme drought. We're not severe. We are in a drought, which is not, it's never good, but it's not severe. But it was just, and they were warned. So the National Weather Service out of Hawaii warned them starting Sunday night that we were going to have these conditions with the really gusty winds, the dry grounds. I think that's really the biggest culprit. You are just looking at kindling, just flaming these fires, and also the relatively low humidity. So we're not getting those storms. We're not getting the rain to help kind of, bring the moisture in. So yeah, we're not looking at extreme drought. Like, we always want to, connect it to climate change, but there's no huge red flags that are connecting this. We're going to continue to look at it, but nothing is out there that's saying this is exactly why this happened. It was really those 3 ingredients coming together.
Well, and that's the point with climate change. They're accelerants, and it's not always directly, and we all know that. Anyway, Michelle Grossman, thank you. I'm joined now on the phone by Congresswoman Jill Tokuda. She represents the 2nd District of Hawaii's congressional districts. That includes the island of Maui. She's trying to get home. She was on a congressional delegation, bipartisan visit to Israel. She's cutting that short, trying to get home, even as people are trying to get off the island. Congresswoman, I know you're trying to get information like the rest of us. You obviously know people. What do you know? And based on what you're hearing, what do you think the island needs right now?
First and foremost, this is just a heartbreaking, devastating situation for everyone. I have talked to individuals who have lost loved ones, who have lost homes, businesses. This is really going to take us not just weeks or months to come back from this, but literally generations and years. Right now, we need boots on the ground, and we have seen them come through from the U.S. Coast Guard to our defense partners to every single county to make sure that we can put out these hotspots and these fires. It is now a search and rescue and recovery effort. We don't even know the full extent of the damage. We've got assessment teams on the ground. I know the governor's going in, the superintendent of schools is going in to really determine what is the extent of the damage. And then we can really start to look at stabilizing life for people. You've seen it in the videos, literally food and shelter are necessary. And so we've got to be able to provide the most basic things for our residents right now.
Many Americans are used to hearing about wildfires in California. Wildfires in Hawaii are not familiar to folks. Talk about this threat that has been there for years, I guess. How often and what kind of preparations are made on a moderate drought year like this?
Well, we have been experiencing pretty severe drought conditions in recent years, and we're familiar with, sadly, brush fires that have taken out huge acreages of land on all of our islands. I think what made this particular situation very unique is we had our eyes on the hurricane itself. That was the danger. And yet 800 miles away, those winds picked up to levels that really, as was said, created a perfect storm where those dry conditions, those heavy winds literally whipped into the worst wildfires we've ever seen. I think what exacerbated that was much of this happened in the cover of night, early morning. People were literally running and fleeing for their lives, and in some cases nowhere to go but jump into the ocean. And so, you know, this really was something unexpected and definitely not something that we had been able to anticipate or plan for.
Look, Maui's economy is tourism, pure and simple, right? I mean, there really isn't a second economy per se. So rebuilding for tourism is what needs to be done. How hard is this going to be? How many, you said generations. I mean, is there going to be different ways that things have to be rebuilt, or this is just a case of we're just going to rebuild?
You know, I think we saw this, sadly, if you think back decades ago when Hurricane Iniki literally leveled the island of Kauai. When I saw the pictures from the air, it took me back to Iniki and what Kauai looked like. It also took me to war zone pictures that we've seen. If you take a look at the footage of just burnt out cars and buildings, rubble, nothing absolutely left. And similar to Kauai, tourism is the main, stay of the economy for Lahaina. And so I do think this is going to take us literally years to determine how we rebuild and what the economy of Lahaina and Maui as a whole starts to look like. It was definitely at its peak right now in the summer season. It's come to an absolute halt. This is why the federal declaration by the president made such a difference today when he did this quickly, allowing us to tap into needed resources for this community and our state.
Well, speaking of federal assistance, I'm about to have the FEMA administrator on. Anything directly you'd like to ask her for?
Please send everything you can our way. We are going to be on the ground helping people to sign up for those programs. We need everything from roofs over people's head to making sure that they can have transportation to work, rebuild their businesses. Life has grinded to a halt for too many of our residents, and they need help now. And
it may be months at a minimum that they're going to need assistance like this. Congresswoman Tokuda, travel safe. We know you need to get there, and we know you want to get there as soon as you can. Thanks very much. Let me turn now to FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell. Administrator Criswell, thanks for coming on. Talk about the unique challenges. Look, FEMA's got to be there for U.S. territories, for islands. Hawaii's a state that's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It only adds to the difficulty of getting needed help there. Just describe that extra challenge and how important is the U.S. military assets here?
Yeah, Chuck, you're exactly right. We deal with the unfortunate impact of these disasters, across the United States. And every time one of these happens in one of our island, either states as in Hawaii or our territories, it just adds another level and another dimension of challenge into our ability to respond because of the time and distance. I think what's fortunate for us is we have an office because of this in Hawaii, on Oahu. We also have a logistics center, a distribution center that has food and water and cots and supplies so we can have it ready to go. And we're using that today to go out and start to help those that have been displaced by this fire. The one thing that we have to keep in mind because of this is that time is so precious. And so we really have to anticipate working with the governor and his team on what is going to be needed, not just today, tomorrow, but next week and the week after that, so we can begin moving those resources today. And then if we don't need them, we'll turn them around. But we want to get them moving as quickly as possible, even if we think we might need it, but we're just not quite sure yet. Is getting these fires put out now part of FEMA's job, too? What we will do as part of the disaster declaration is reimburse the costs that the state is experiencing and encumbering to put out these fires, but it also gives us the ability, if they need more resources, we now have the full ability to bring in all different federal resources to come in and support. So it gives us that ability to bring in additional federal partners to come in and support, but also reimburse for some of those expenses that are eligible, which is the majority of them, for the costs that they're incurring to try to continue to put out these fires. So many of us are used to, having to prepare for disasters we can at least anticipate. A flood, a hurricane, a tornado. No one says that they're planned, but there's a mindset. This almost feels like, is this a disaster a resident could have prepared for? You know, I think the biggest thing that we need to focus on is that communities across the United States really need to have a better understanding of what their risks are today, because the risks and the severe weather events we're seeing are much bigger in scope and scale than we saw 5 or 10 years ago. We've also had a lot of people move to different parts of the country that may have never experienced a wildfire, whether it's here in Hawaii or other parts that are used to it. So we've been really focused on how do we get that message out? How do we help communities understand what their risks are so they can take the measures that they need to make sure that they have plans in place to protect themselves and their families. And we focus, again, not just with the individuals, but with all of our emergency managers around the nation. How do we help build your capacity and put the right plans in place? I think as we're seeing this unfold today and we're seeing how quickly it intensified, this has been the type of severe weather events that we've been seeing across the nation, as they have just intensified so much more rapidly. So we really have to work on how are we preparing our communities to respond to that faster, so we have time, we don't lose time, and we have the right amount of time to get people out of harm's way.
But, you know, there's some communities that are experiencing extreme weather that those communities never had before. I think about tornado warnings in Maine. Okay, Maine and the, really, not to say it's never been recorded, but it's rarely recorded. Not anymore, right? We're now starting to see those things. I mean, I say this, I don't think many people living in Maui probably thought wildfires were going to be the first thing they'd have to worry about. Certainly, I guess that's part of this education process is you almost have to have an imagination now for extreme weather.
Well, and I think it's maybe imagination, yes, but we have resources, right? We have technology through NOAA and NASA that have great tools to help us model and anticipate the types of severe weather events that communities are going to experience. And so when I talk about helping people understand risk, we have to bring the science in. We have to bring the data in and the modeling to help them visualize what is potentially going to be a disastrous event for them in the future, because it's certainly not the same as what they've experienced 5 or 10 years ago. Just like you mentioned in Maine, we're seeing these kinds of events, but even just record-breaking events, record-breaking rain events where they get rain, but they've never seen it at the scale that they're seeing it today.
Do we have an idea of how this fire started? Is it an accident? Was it a campfire? Is it, a bonfire that got out of hand? Do we know yet? Is there an investigation?
Yeah.
I assume?
I would certainly defer you to the state on the cause, and I'm not sure where they're at in the investigation. I think the biggest thing is that we know that it was amplified by these severe winds that came forward and pushed it into the communities.
FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell with the latest on all the efforts there. Good luck.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Still ahead, the special counsel's newly proposed trial timeline for former President Trump puts the 2024 election interference trial on a collision course with the start of 2024 voting. Plus, an Ecuadorian presidential candidate is assassinated days before the election, moments after a campaign rally, and just the latest sign of an increase in political violence around the world. This one is connected to one of the cartels that controls the fentanyl trade around the world. All of this is connected, folks. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Turning now to some important breaking news for quite a few worried families out there out of Iran. The White House has confirmed that 4 Americans who had been wrongfully detained at the notorious Evin prison in Tehran have been released from that prison and placed under house arrest as part of the first phase of a planned prisoner swap. A 5th U.S. citizen who is already under house arrest is also expected to be part of this deal. As part of the exchange, an unknown number of Iranian that are detained here in the United States will be returned to Iran, and the U.S. is going to release roughly $6 billion, with a capital B, dollars in Iranian government assets that have currently been blocked under U.S. sanctions. We should note the White House says negotiations remain ongoing. They're delicate, and nothing's done yet. But if the agreement proceeds, Iran will only be able to access those funds for food, medication, and other humanitarian purposes, with Qatar overseeing those funds. But of course, we know that money is fungible, and you know what that means. But joining me on set is Andrea Mitchell, who has been tracking this story. So, Andrea, it looks like we basically paid a ransom for kidnapped Americans. Is that is it that simple?
Not exactly.
Okay.
Because this is Iranian money. It's been held in South Korea. So Iran was able to, under the sanctions...
Why in South Korea, by the way? Were they just the third party?
Several countries have been permitted to buy Iranian oil for their needs under the sanctions, as long as the money is held in their countries and is only released to Iran eventually for their use for food or medicine. So in this case, this is the South Korean tranche, if you will, the $6 billion, and it's going to be sent to Qatar, which is going to transfer it into European currencies. I mean, they have to go through several steps to get it.
Some people call that laundering. I mean, it would be called, if it wasn't doing it this way, it would be called laundering.
It's a legitimate treasury transaction to get it into a currency that Iran can use. So it's not to clean it.
Fair enough.
Fair enough. It's to be able to buy the food and the medicine. And Qatar is going to be responsible for dispensing it. It's not going to go to Iran. Qatar will be responsible for making sure it doesn't go for, let's just say, theoretically, drones that go to Russia. I mean, there are a lot of bad things.
But then Iran can take money that it was using for medicine and move it to... I mean, that's what I mean by money is fungible. We can claim there's a silo, but there's not.
I'm not going to make that case.
Fair enough.
But I'm going to say that these Americans, you know, you've got Siamak Namazi's been there for almost 8 years in Evin prison. We don't know what kind of condition he's in. They are now under house arrest.
Are they in the Swiss embassy right now?
They're in a hotel with the Swiss ambassador, eyes on. The Brits have an embassy, you know, in Tehran as well. So we have allies there helping. The Swiss were really key to getting this done, and Qatar. You know, all of these allies, Oman and other countries in the area. The fact is that these people were, some of them didn't even have trials. They were just charged, sentenced. It was Alice in Wonderland. You're a spy, espionage.
So we have 5 Americans going to be released. How many more Americans do the Iranians have?
There aren't any more American citizens, we are told. There are people with American green cards. They're not U.S. citizens, and they have not, one man, Mr. Dalili, rather, we've been talking to family members. I've been talking to their daughters, some of these people who are being released. Their stories are just, you know, Mr. Tabaz, Murad Tabaz's wife, Vida, was in Tehran and was not given an exit visa. So these daughters have not seen their mother or their father for years. And now they will be reunited. Any
American of Iranian descent probably shouldn't be traveling to Iran, right?
Absolutely not.
They are going to be, the Iranians now, I mean, doesn't this almost raise the risk of more American citizens of Iranian descent to get kidnapped?
Just like Americans should not go to North Korea, Americans should not go to Russia. That's what they will tell you because of Evan Gershkovich. So many correspondents have left.
Well, as a journalist, sometimes journalists are, you know, you get that, the people that like hike for the fun of it, you're like, what are you doing?
Remember that.
Yeah.
I was there when the hikers were released, in fact. So we interviewed Jason Rezaian today from the Washington Post. You know, he was there for 588 days in Evin prison. He still feels the PTSD. He doesn't want to be in small spaces. He said he knows what they're going through, and they will not be released until that money is transferred.
Oh, wow.
And once they are released and homebound, that's when the Americans will be released.
How many other American allies?
Excuse me, that's when the Iranians will be released.
How many other South Koreas are out there? American allies who are holding Iranian money where the Iranians are looking for...
About 3 or 4.
Yeah.
And here's what's also happening. My colleague, Dan DeLuce, our colleague, has been working on this, posted in February. There are secret, separate talks on the nuclear issues, which will be informal, not a treaty that can get that passed, but to freeze it below weapons grade. They've already gone past that. They are weeks away from having enough nuclear fuel for a weapon.
So, in theory, this is not supposed to be a part of this, but having this done might open the door to that.
That's what they're hoping.
Okay.
And just one other thing. Senator, you know, senators are already complaining, Republican senators, and President Obama did the same thing and was hammered. So this is,
you know, everybody's attitude on this changes when it's somebody they know that's been detained. That's something people need to figure out.
So smart.
Andrea Mitchell, thank you for this. Up next, former President Trump and one of his co-defendants pled not guilty in the latest charges in the classified documents case, as even more potential criminal charges loom over the GOP frontrunner. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. So special counsel Jack Smith wants Donald Trump's election interference trial to begin right at the start of the 2024 campaign season. In a filing today, the special counsel requested the trial to begin on January 2nd, saying it would vindicate the public's strong interest in a speedy trial. That date is less than 2 weeks before the Iowa caucuses. And a 4 to 6 week trial, that's on the short end of things. Some people think it could be longer than that, could keep Trump largely off the trail during the key early voting states of New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada, and, of course, Iowa. This is just a proposed start date, and we know Trump's legal team has until next Thursday to respond. That proposed trial schedule comes on the same day that both of Trump's co-defendants in the classified documents case appeared in a Florida courtroom, with one of them, Mar-a-Lago property manager Carlos de Oliveira, still not able to be arraigned 2 weeks after he was indicted because he's yet to secure an attorney, which has become a bigger problem in that case. For more, I'm joined by our panel, Peter Baker, Chief White House Correspondent for the New York Times and an NBC News political analyst, Kimberly Atkins-Storr, Boston Globe columnist and NBC political analyst, and Sarah Chamberlain, Republican strategist and president and CEO of Republican Main Street Partnership. All right, let's do the trial calendar here. Peter Baker, the likelihood is Trump's going to ask for something, and my guess is they're going to go to December, right? They, in a negotiation, but realistically, we're probably looking at somewhere in the spring, right?
Yeah, and look, this judge is not as sympathetic to President Trump as the other judge in Florida, so he may not get quite as much leeway as he got in that instance in terms of the classified documents case. But just imagine for a second if this actually were to happen, right? Trial 1 January, trial 2 March, trial 3 May. I mean, you don't have to necessarily be in court every single day, I suppose, but that's a lot of court time. Kimberly, you've got a JD, so you know what's the likely scenario? So prosecutors ask for this, defense is going to ask, what does we expect this judge to be, on the speedier side? So what would be your educated guess here?
I think if the defense comes back with something reasonable, and that is a big if, they're going to ask for more time.
They're going to ask for
January
25.
Never. How about never? Does never work for you? And in that case, the judge will probably be more inclined to make it on the earlier side if they seem to not be acting in good faith. Clearly, Jack Smith has laid out a case. He says, this is how long it's going to take me to put on. We're ready to go. This is how long it'll take to present a prosecution and defense, and that we could do this. So unless they present a reason beyond just, well, there's an election coming to put this off.
Well, I mean, if you were in their shoes and you're like, look, we want it sometime between the primaries and the convention. Do you ask for it? Do you ask for it in June or July?
That won't be a good reason.
Yeah,
it would be, this is what we need to be able to put on an effective defense. And if they can't show that, then it'll be very difficult.
Sarah, I know what you wish would happen, but what do you expect campaigns to do? Are they going to continue to do what they're doing, which is ignore Trump on this stuff?
I think they will, because what we see over and over again is every time he gets indicted, his polls go up. I've never seen anything like it. That's why he's called Teflon Don. It's shocking what's happening here.
Speaking of shocking, I want to play this ad because that he's running right now, an attack ad on the next prosecutor in Atlanta. They bought at cable TV. It's $1 million ad buy. It's Atlanta, Washington, D.C., and New York. It is designed to hit basically the Atlanta community and then the media capitals. Take a look at it.
And Biden's newest lackey, Atlanta DA, Fani Willis. So incompetent, on her watch, violent crimes have exploded. So tainted, Willis was thrown off one case for trying to prosecute a political opponent.
I should note that Willis felt like she had to put out an email to her staff after this attack ad aired. We have a job to do in this office. We prosecute based on the facts of the law. The law is nonpartisan. No employee of this office may make any public comments related to the noise. Your instruction for me is to ignore all the noise and keep doing your job with excellence. Peter, I'm old enough to remember when the first time he attacked Mueller, everybody went, oh, my God, what is going to happen?
Yeah.
Right? And whatever you think of the Clintons muttered about Ken Starr more in private and in blind quotes. They didn't overtly go after him. Now this is like, just every day. We're numb to this. This is perfectly legal.
Yeah.
And absolutely an erosion of the democracy.
Completely unusual, unprecedented maybe. We use that word too much, but the problem is Trump has normalized so much of this that you kind of shrug and say, okay, it's just another week in the Trump show. But
she's prosecuting him next week. She's indicting him next week.
Right, and it used to be, and Kimberly's a lawyer, I'm not, but I mean, the idea that you would attack a prosecutor. And by the way, he's attacked judges and juries and grand juries. He's attacked everybody.
No, we go back, the judge who was of Mexican descent, right?
Yeah,
after
absolutely.
And it's just sort of,
this isn't even though an offhand comment. This is an ad. This
paid
is
for by the Trump campaign.
Yeah. That's a whole level.
They made sure to pay for it with their own campaign. I mean, I don't.
Because they want it to be about politics.
It's just politics.
But it covers it legally.
To quote Bob Dole, where's the outrage?
Yeah.
We're numb to it now. There's so much of it that I'm sorry to say, but we've appeared to have turned it off.
But it's not just politics, though. It's also an attempt to try to destroy the legal process so that he can later claim, oh, it was unfair. It was broke. He's taken a sledgehammer to it so that he can later claim that it's broken, and therefore he can't get a fair trial.
Right.
Exactly.
He sits there and attacks and then says, well, she hates me.
Correct.
Right.
How do you know? Well, I attacked her. She must.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just this like it feels
unheard
like
of.
Right. It's a never-ending loop, and yet there doesn't. I mean, again, I go back to this is perfectly legal.
Yes. Yeah, it really is, and that's why he's doing it under the Politico, because you get a lot more leeway running a Politico ad.
Yeah. But it diminishes, as you're saying, I mean, it diminishes the credibility of the system. That's what he wants to do. He just wants it to be, it's, a Democrat versus Republican. You've seen this before. That's all it is. It's not about the legal system. It's not about an impartial justice system. It's about politics. That's what he wants his supporters to believe.
And they do believe it.
And they do.
I mean, that's what's shocking. They really do.
So, is there any? Are we now? I start to worry that our coverage now just assumes none of this matters.
Yeah.
Are we now over-calibrating on that front, Sarah?
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
You don't think it'll matter to primary voters?
When he said, and we all were shocked, when he said he could go kill somebody on Fifth Avenue, and we're like, no way. He might be able to. I mean, I don't know what is going to erode his base. They don't care. They love this.
I think the only thing that can happen is for reasonable people, Democrats and Republicans alike, to support and defend our institutions and say, look, you can like or dislike whoever you want as a candidate, but our justice system is important and we need to believe in it.
It's funny you say that. I'm trying to think of all the elected Republicans that have stood up and said that in the last couple of weeks.
Can you name any?
Right.
Yeah.
Right, Chris Christie.
I mean, Chris Christie.
Right.
Who was sort of sitting there saying, look, no matter what you think, everybody who is indicted thinks the system's unfair.
Right.
Okay? I think we now know that. I get that, okay? But if we live in a society like this, what are we going to have?
Right.
But I think the elected officials have become numb to this as well. I mean, I think that we have this whole, what is going to break us out of the trance that we're all in?
And there's a structural issue that he's taking advantage of. These are Democrats, and they are elected officials, that is in New York and in Georgia. And obviously Merrick Garland and Jack Smith are appointed by a Democratic administration. So they may be doing everything exactly right. They may be following all the rules.
The whole point of appointing Jack Smith was to take politics out of it.
Which we knew would never happen,
right?
Because it was inevitable that Trump was going to make him political, whether he was or not. And Jack Smith can have done every single thing right, follow the book entirely, and Trump would still be saying all this stuff.
Joe Manchin. Let's do something that's a little more normal as far as political debates were concerned, which is the future of Joe Manchin. What party will he be in? What office is he going to run? Today he floated the idea of being an independent, which frankly, I think some people are wondering, why is he still a member of the Democratic Party, other than the chairmanship of the Energy Committee?
Well, that we've seen coming for a long time. That's a surprise to no one. But depending on what his next aspiration is, he's in a system that just doesn't work. If you wanted to run, say, for president as an independent, how do you do that when we have the electoral count system? If there was some sort of plurality kind of system like we've talked about before, that could be a future. But right now, with the polarization that is only being fomented with everything we've talked about, I just don't see where that goes. This is no country for an independent.
Is this what a guy who wants to win re-election would say in West Virginia, though, Sarah?
No,
I'm an independent now.
No. And he can't win.
You think that's done?
I think Governor Justice will defeat him. And I do think Governor Justice would be Alex Mooney in the primary.
The question is whether Joe Manchin runs for re-election.
I don't think he will, ultimately. I don't think he wants to lose.
He's looking for a way out. Is this what the presidential stuff is?
You say all this stuff, you're looking for an out, I think, right? It sounds like you're looking for an out.
Because you have the independent float now. Yeah. I mean, it does feel like he's setting something up.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And he is up in 2024, so he's got to make a decision here one way or the other.
And look, he's been remarkably successful over the years in a really hard state for Democrats, give him credit for that. But there's no sign that there's a national following there for him.
The irony is that the Republicans are going to have Jim Justice, which is the version of Joe Manchin of the Republican Party. He just joined.
Yeah, that's right.
he is literally a Republican in name only. So good luck, Mitch McConnell. Anyway, Peter, Kimberly, Sarah, good to see you all. After the break, 2024 presidential presidential candidates descend on Des Moines for one of the primary season's most beloved and buttery traditions. And a former Republican presidential candidate will join me on set to talk about what that's like. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. The Iowa caucus season is officially underway because today is the opening day of the Iowa State Fair, the best state fair in the country, unless you live in Minnesota, Wisconsin, or Indiana, because you'll think your state fair is better. But over the next 10 days, Iowans from all 99 counties will flock to Des Moines to pay their respects to the butter cow, sample the latest food items being fried and put on a stick, and hear from just about everyone running for president, except Chris Christie. North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum and former Vice President Mike Pence were on hand for the fair's opening day. Burgum gets the honor of being the first candidate spotted in an apron grilling pork with the governor of Iowa, Kim Reynolds. Former President Donald Trump, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, both will make their Iowa State Fair pilgrimage on Saturday. And joining me now is someone who knows a lot about running in Iowa and running against Donald Trump. It's the former governor of Wisconsin, Republican Scott Walker. He is now the president of the Young Americans Foundation, which is going to be a participant in the first debate, correct?
That's right. Yeah, we're going to be partners.
Students are going to be asking questions, and this is the old Young Americans for Freedom.
Yeah,
rebranded.
You know, when Muff Buckley started it,
back when we were in school, they were the Young Americans for Freedom, right? The Reagan wing of the college Republicans.
That's exactly
as one might call it back in the day. Let's talk about this race. Where is it? Is it sometimes I look at it and think we have two primaries. There's the Donald Trump events, and then there's sort of who's going to be the chief alternative to Donald Trump, which is some similarities to your race in 2016.
It was 8 years ago. There was a lot of that. In fact, I remember wearing that same apron. You just talked about Doug Burgum. I had a pork chop in one hand, a Leinenkugel in the other hand with Kim Reynolds as well.
That felt like the good old days of Kim. That was the fun stuff.
Oh, yeah, that is good times. Some of the other attacks, not so much. But I think you're right. And it's not just the national part. A lot of times people get consumed in these national polls, the national pairings. But as you know, Chuck, it depends on what are you doing in Iowa, New Hampshire, in our case, South Carolina, Nevada, those early states. That's where it really makes the difference. And in each of those states, you see Tim Scott, for example, picking up some ground in Iowa. You see Chris Christie playing around a little bit in New Hampshire. I think it's wide open in terms of who that alternative is. And really, the best thing...
Do you think voters want an alternative?
Well, you know, one of the polls that came out about a week and a half ago actually showed that a significant number of people who identify as Donald Trump supporters are at least willing to listen to another candidate if someone's elevated through the debate process. It's why I've argued, if I was advising Donald Trump, don't be conventional. Actually come to that first debate, make the case, be commanding. As I saw him firsthand on the stage, I was standing right next to him. He took charge of those debates, and that pretty much will put an end to it.
You know, in June, you and I did a podcast, and it was based off an op-ed you wrote that certainly many of people like me interpreted as some advice to Governor DeSantis. And let me pull an excerpt. Primary voters admired what I did in Wisconsin, but wanted my plans for the U.S. to be as tenacious as they were during my time in office. In retrospect, I should have embraced risk, laid out an aggressive agenda. Without a distinguishing pitch, I blended in with many of the other candidates. The only one who really stood out was Donald Trump. Do you see DeSantis making too many of this, now in hindsight, same mistakes that you may have made?
Totally. The biggest problem is listening to consultants, particularly D.C.-based consultants. You should, dance with the date that you went to the dance with.
Okay.
And I think too often you start listening to people and say, play it safe. In his case and mine, both distinguished records. People love what we did as governors. But that just gets you on the stage. That doesn't win the race for you. And so I think in less than 2 weeks, when he and the others show up in Milwaukee for that first debate, he's got to come out swinging. He's got to show that he's got a bold agenda, that it's not enough to just...
What is his agenda?
Well,
it's funny you say that. I don't know what it is. I know he talks about what he did in Florida, right? And what he wants to do to the swamp and to this or that. But, like, Mike Pence just put out an energy plan. I haven't seen that from
When it's got to nail down not only to a plan, but what are those things? That first debate on, we knew Donald Trump was going to drain the swamp. He was going to build a wall.
One thing.
Whether you agreed or not with any of those things, you knew every person from the primary voter to general election voter. And that's what someone like Governor DeSantis. Now, I think he can do it. He obviously was very effective in not only getting elected, but getting reelected in a state that up until recently had been a battleground competitive state. But you got to go past the consultants. You got to loosen up and you got to take some risk. Something I didn't do. And had I done, who knows? Maybe it would have been different.
Right. But is it possible that maybe this is too big a stage for him?
Oh, I mean, I think, between his background in the House of Representatives, having been governor in a state that's effectively like a major, you're talking Texas, California, New York, and Florida. Those are the big states. I think he can step up to it. I think he's proven that as governor. The question is whether or not you're willing to take that risk.
What do you make of so many candidates not taking on the former president with all the political, look, whatever you think of the legal problems he has, whether you think it's politicized or not, it's baggage to swing voters. Why do you think there hasn't been a more effective case against him?
Well, there's two parts to it. So you said swing voters, and then there's primary voters.
And I get that primary voters are in one place.
And to primary voters, it's like attacking a member of the family. Even if it's not your favorite member, when an attack is against one of the family members, the rest of the family says, hey, we handle this internally. Don't go out to the bar and start complaining to your friends and neighbors. And I think that's really what's happening right now. And even with general election voters, I said this when the indictments, at least the federal indictments, came out. I said there's a risk for the left for that backfiring as well, because one of the things we saw last fall was candidates who spent too much time on the Republican side talking about the last election were the ones left in the wayside. The governors who were up for re-election were talking about the future. They won big. That was where the true red wave was at. The ones who talked about the past didn't. If you're, granted, the indictments aren't being done by the party, but if you're a liberal saying, hey, this is going to counter swing voters, a lot of those swing voters are saying, I want to know, what are you going to do next? What are you going to do about the future?
Right, but how is a nomination of Donald Trump going to be a campaign about the future? How does the Republican Party avoid a referendum on Trump in the past if he is the standard bearer?
Well, he's going to have to, and I apply what I said in that editorial, not only to Ron DeSantis and the others, but to the president himself. He can't just talk about what he accomplished before, what the problems were before. He's going to have to lay out, what are you going to do about the economy? What are you going to do about bringing inflation down? What are you going to do about helping parents control their children's education? What are you going to do about help keeping cost of college tuition down? Those sorts of things and plenty of others are going to have to be at the forefront of his campaign.
Let me ask you about what happened in Ohio. Because in some ways, the Supreme Court justice race, you believe that was a resource problem, not a messaging problem. I am hearing the same thing from conservatives in Ohio. Oh, no, it's a resource issue, not a messaging issue. At what point is it a message issue? At what point is it the substance? That maybe you have the wrong position.
Well, I mean, look at Mike DeWine. Mike DeWine signed some of the most pro-life laws in the nation, and he won in Ohio last fall by 25 points. 1 million more votes were cast for him than the Democrat running on a very pro-abortion position. So what that tells me is if Republicans are just focused on one issue, they're going to have a bit of a challenge. If you do what not just DeWine, but Kim Reynolds, Ron DeSantis, Greg Abbott, all these other governors who are pro-life did, and run on a full-scale agenda, I think they've got a shot. If it's just one thing...
But a referendum on abortion, you don't win.
Well, at least in swing
some of these states.
Because the money's not on the side of the pro-life position.
Why is that?
Well, because there's not a financial interest for those. It's a moral issue, but it's not a financial issue.
All right. Scott Walker, there's always a lot more to talk to you about, but I don't have enough time. Good to see you.
Good to be with you. Go Packers.
Go Packers. Jordan Love. Up ahead, one of Ecuador's presidential candidates gunned down after a campaign rally. How trying to rid his country of corruption and a drug cartel may have gotten him killed. That's next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Ecuadorian presidential candidate Fernando Villavicencio was assassinated yesterday, just 10 days before voting was set to begin. Cell phone video captured the moment as he leaves a campaign rally surrounded by security. But before we show this footage, we're going to warn you, it's disturbing, and you may want to simply look away. And while Villavicencio was not the front runner in the election, he was an outspoken critic of corruption, had vowed to crack down on organized crime, and he was considered one of the major candidates. Prior to the shooting, he said he had received multiple death threats, including from affiliates of Mexico's Sinaloa cartel. He was also a journalist and an activist who was known for his work investigating and uncovering corruption in the government connected to the cartel. An Ecuadorian political scientist told the New York Times that electorally, this year in Ecuador is the single most violent in the country's history, adding that it's going to change the way we conceive of politics because from now on, it becomes a high-risk profession. This is true now in Mexico. Now it's in Ecuador. This is very troubling. Joining me now is Will Freeman, Fellow for Latin American Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. And Will, when you see Sinaloa cartel connected to this, you know, this is not just an Ecuador story. This is a story of what's happening to politicians in Mexico, politicians in Ecuador. We saw this 20 years ago in Colombia. Is this a cartel problem?
You're right that there are disturbing similarities. Ecuador already seems to be pretty far down the path that Colombia took 20 years ago, that Mexico took 10 years ago. But I think at this point, we have to be cautious. We don't know yet who was behind the assassination of Fernando Villavicencio. 6 suspects have been taken into custody. Another died in a shootout with police. It's true that Villavicencio had been receiving death threats from one of Ecuador's largest gangs, Los Choneros, who do work with one Mexican cartel. But at this point, we still don't have all the facts. Fortunately, Ecuadorian President Guillermo Lasso has invited the FBI to lead an investigation, which will begin shortly. Until then, I'm not sure that we can say we know who was behind this.
So let me ask you this. I saw that in response to this, there seems to be some powers that the current president of Ecuador is putting out there. Should we be concerned about the future of this democracy?
Absolutely. I think there was already reason to be concerned, all the more so now. Ecuador is a country which has been dealing with surging crime since 2020. It used to be known as the Island of Peace because it was much more peaceful historically than Colombia or Peru, its neighbors. On top of that, the country's dealing with really intense left-right polarization. There is a populist ex-president, Rafael Correa, who's loomed large over the country's politics, whose candidate for president is now actually in the lead. He and his followers and his opponents are clashing constantly, actually putting a solution to this crime crisis further out of reach. So I think there's a number of reasons we should be very worried. It might not be the biggest country in South America. It might not have the economy that's most important to the U.S., but this is a hotspot of insecurity and violence.
But I was just going to say the region feels like we're seeing governance issues in Central America. Obviously, look, what's the fact that northern Mexico is not governed tells you we've got governance issue in Mexico, even if Mexico's government would dispute that. What could the U.S. be doing more of that it isn't doing here?
Sure. So when I was in Ecuador a couple of months ago, speaking to cabinet-level ministers, advisors of President Lasso, what I heard time and time again is that the interagency process in D.C. is too slow. Ecuador needs help yesterday, not a week from now or a month from now. There needs to be more assistance in terms of intelligence gathering, investigations, making sure that the justice system in Ecuador can actually dismantle the organized crime structures and their financiers behind these terrible crimes like the killing of Villavicencio.
It is interesting. Look, Colombia invited us in when we finally were able to help them. Ecuador's inviting the FBI. Do you expect them to invite more U.S. help in this front?
Everything hinges on the outcome of this election. Now, as I mentioned, the front runner, she is an ally of ex-President Rafael Correa, who cut off all cooperation with the DEA, who had quite a frosty relationship with the United States. If Luisa Gonzalez, his candidate, wins, I do expect that Ecuador and the U.S. will just have to continue to cooperate because of the severity of this problem. But I expect that cooperation to be dialed down. Without any of the other candidates, I do think that the security partnership will deepen.
You saw what that Ecuadorian political scientist said, that, look, this is now a high-risk profession. It feels that way in Mexico now, too.
Absolutely. I think the worst case scenario for Ecuador is that it ends up somewhere like the north of Mexico, as you mentioned, an area in which in many places state officials are co-governing with organized crime groups, with cartels. I think we're already, frankly, seeing that in parts of Ecuador, specifically on the coast, on the Pacific coast. But the real fear is that this could go national.
And when you look at the Sinaloa cartel, I mean, I know we don't know yet, but is this sort of what they have tentacles all over Latin America, do they not?
Increasingly, they do. It used to be the Colombians that ran the drug trade in Ecuador. After the peace accord in Colombia, those structures were dismantled, but the Mexican cartels swept in, took advantage of that. And right now, we have 2 of Mexico's biggest cartels, the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel, which are actually battling for control of drug trafficking in Ecuador through local proxies.
And this isn't just Ecuador. These 2 cartels, which used to be, I guess, it's a splinter of the one, right? They're having these turf battles all over, are they not?
Yeah, I think Ecuador is the biggest hotspot, but you do notice them cropping up elsewhere. Brazilian organized crime also very present in places like Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay. So you're seeing these organized crime groups that start in one country branching out to many others.
Yeah, well, as always, for whatever reason, U.S. policy with our backyard always seems to be more on the back burner than the front burner until we face a crisis like this. Will Freeman, really appreciate you adding your expertise to this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chuck.
And thank you all for being with us this hour. I'll be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now coverage continues with Aaron Gilchrist, who's in for Hallie Jackson.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.